What if the most dangerous conflicts in the world today don't start with missiles? What if they start with something far less visible? A GPS signal failing, a shipping lane slowing, a cyber intrusion inside a logistics company, or a disruption that prevents life-saving medicines from reaching hospitals. Because that is increasingly what modern geopolitical competition looks like. Not conquest. Pressure on systems. And nowhere is this clearer right now than across Europe's two strategic flanks: the Baltic Sea in the north and the Strait of Hormuz in the south. Part 1. The Modernization of Coercion. For most of the 20th century, geopolitical competition was relatively clear. Power was measured through armies, territory, and industrial production. Conflicts unfolded through visible escalation: tanks crossing borders, airstrikes, naval blockades. But the strategic environment today is changing. Globalization has connected the world through deeply interdependent systems: energy networks, shipping routes, satellite navigation, digital infrastructure, supply chains. These systems make the global economy extraordinarily efficient. But they also create new strategic vulnerabilities, because disrupting the system can now produce enormous geopolitical leverage. You no longer need to destroy infrastructure. You only need to introduce uncertainty and friction. Part 2. Europe's northern flank. Nowhere is this more visible than across the Baltic Sea region. Over the past several years, Northern Europe has experienced a growing pattern of hybrid pressure. Aircraft have reported GPS interference affecting navigation systems. Undersea communication cables in the Baltic have suffered suspicious damage. Governments and infrastructure providers continue to face persistent cyber intrusions, and intelligence services have warned about drone reconnaissance near ports, military facilities, and energy infrastructure. Individually, each of these incidents might appear technical or isolated, but together they create a continuous environment of pressure below the threshold of war. The objective is not to trigger immediate conflict. It is to complicate decision-making and introduce uncertainty inside democratic systems. Part 3. Europe's southern flank. At the same time, Europe faces a second source of systemic instability: the Middle East, specifically the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical maritime choke points in the world. Roughly 1/5 of global oil trade passes through this narrow waterway. Recent military strikes and rising tensions in the region have already pushed oil prices upward and increased shipping risk, but the consequences go far beyond energy. One of the least discussed impacts of the conflict is its effect on medical supply chains. Pharmaceutical logistics depend heavily on stable aviation routes and tightly controlled cold chain transport systems. When conflict disrupts air corridors across the Gulf region, the delivery of temperature-sensitive medicines, including cancer treatments, can be delayed or interrupted. This illustrates a crucial reality of modern conflict. Strategic pressure now travels through civilian infrastructure, energy markets, shipping networks, aviation routes, even healthcare systems. Part 4. Chaos as managed instability. What we are seeing across the Baltic and the Gulf is not simply random instability. It represents a broader strategic pattern. Modern coercion increasingly works by managing instability rather than triggering open war. Disrupt navigation systems, probe infrastructure, amplify political divisions, interfere with logistics, slow supply chains. Each individual action may appear ambiguous, but together they generate persistent friction across interconnected systems. This model does not rely on overwhelming military force. It relies on something else: ambiguity. Because when attribution is unclear, political responses become slower and more complicated. And in institutions like NATO or the European Union, where coordination between many governments is required, time itself becomes a strategic advantage. Part 5. The strategic question. This is why today's geopolitical competition is no longer simply about military strength. It is about something deeper: resilience. Resilience of infrastructure, resilience of supply chains, resilience of democratic institutions, and resilience of societies operating under constant strategic pressure. Because in a world defined by interdependence, the defining question is no longer just who has the strongest military. It is whose systems continue functioning when instability becomes the strategy. The Baltic Sea, the Strait of Hormuz, two very different regions, but both revealing the same emerging reality. Modern conflict is no longer only about territory. It is about pressure on the systems that keep our world running. And understanding that shift may be one of the most important strategic challenges of the decade ahead. This has been a Trescudo Intelligence Briefing. Stay focused on the signal.